On April 9th, 1241, a European army of 8,000 men, including the most elite heavily armoured knights in Christendom, faced a Mongol force half their size. By sunset, the European army no longer existed. An entire generation of nobility was annihilated, and the age of the armoured knight was brutally ended. This is the story of how 8,000 of Europe's finest warriors were systematically dismantled and butchered. It was a battle that should have been a victory for them. Instead, it became an execution. At stake was not just the Kingdom of Poland, but the very survival of Western Christendom. The Golden Horde was at the gates of Europe, and this was the army sent to stop them. Their failure would have meant the end of the world as they knew it. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just how this impossible defeat happened, but how the Mongols used a terrifying combination of ancient tactics, psychological terror, and a battlefield innovation that seemed like black magic to their enemies. You'll discover the simple, deadly trap that Europe's greatest knights fell for, not once, but twice, in the same day. You'll learn about the strange, choking black smoke the Mongols unleashed to blind their foes, an unnatural darkness that caused knights to kill their own countrymen in confusion. We will follow Duke Henry the Pious, a man whose faith was as strong as his armour, leading his men into what he believes is a holy crusade. He is about to discover he is facing an enemy that follows no rules of God or man. And finally, you'll understand the incredible twist of fate, an event happening thousands of miles away, that saved Europe from total Mongol conquest after this catastrophic defeat. Why did the most successful army in the world suddenly vanish after its most decisive victory? The answer is the most shocking part of the entire story. To grasp how this catastrophe was even possible, we must rewind. This was not a random invasion, it was a calculated move in a global game of conquest. The Mongol storm had already consumed the Kievan Rus, leaving a trail of shattered cities and ash. By 1241, they stood at the threshold of a fractured Europe, a continent of squabbling kings and dukes whose arrival felt like the apocalypse made real. But the massive Mongol campaign in Poland was not the main event. It was only a distraction. The true target, the grand prize for the supreme commander, Subutai, was the lush plains of Hungary. The 30,000 warriors ravaging Poland were a shield, a pinning force with a single brutal objective: to draw out and destroy any army that might try to ride south to aid the Hungarians. They were not just invaders, they were surgeons, sent to sever a limb from the European body politic, and their intelligence network had told them exactly which man would accept their challenge. That man was Duke Henry II of Silesia, known to history as the Pious. He was the most powerful noble in Poland, a realm already weakened by internal division. For Henry, this was more than a defense of his lands. It was a test of faith, a sacred duty to protect Christendom from the pagan tide. He sent out a call to arms, gathering knights from his own duchy, from the Teutonic Order, and contingents of Templars. In his mind, he was assembling the hammer of Christendom. He had no idea the Mongols were not an anvil, waiting to be struck. They were a net, and it was about to be pulled shut. Leading the Mongol force in Poland was a triumvirate of princes and generals, Baidar, Kadan, and Orda Khan. These were not wild chieftains leading a horde. They were the graduates of the most brutal and effective military academy on earth, the Mongol campaigns themselves. They had spent decades dissecting empires from China to Persia, and they viewed warfare not as a contest of courage, but as a problem of physics and psychology. Their approach was cold, methodical, and inhumanly patient. What made them so terrifying was not their savagery, but their professionalism. They were veterans of 100 battles, commanding an army that moved with the unity of a single organism. Every soldier was a professional, every commander a strategist, and their intelligence on the European kingdoms was frighteningly accurate. They understood the feuds between kings, the pride of the knightly orders, and most importantly, the European obsession with a single decisive tactic, the head-on charge of armoured heavy cavalry. They knew Duke Henry would bring his knights, and they had already prepared the ground to turn that strength into a fatal weakness. This was not a battle they were planning, it was a dissection. On the other side, Henry the Pious was doing exactly what the Mongols predicted. His army was a reflection of the European way of war, a corps of elite, noble-born knights encased in 60 pounds of steel, supported by less armoured cavalry and infantry levies from the towns. He brought together proud Poles, grim German crusaders, and the legendary Knights Templar, a force that on paper looked invincible. But it was a coalition held together by a shared faith and a fragile system of feudal loyalties. Their command structure was a debate among proud nobles, not a singular will. Henry saw the coming battle as his destiny. He was a devout Christian prince, the shield of his people. He believed in the righteousness of his cause and the divine power flowing through his knights. For him and his men, the Mongol was an obstacle to be broken, a wave to be split against the rock of their faith and the points of their lances. They were preparing for a glorious collision of two armies on an open field, a contest of strength and valor. They could not conceive that their enemy had absolutely no intention of fighting that battle. Henry gathered every knight, every banner, and every prayer he could muster, confident that steel and faith would triumph. But as his army marched towards the town of Legnica, the Mongols were already watching from the surrounding hills. They had been watching for days. For them, the question was not if the Europeans would charge. It was precisely where and how they would turn that glorious charge into a perfectly orchestrated suicide. The two armies faced each other across a wide, flat plain near the town of Legnica. For Duke Henry, it was a godsend, the perfect ground for his greatest weapon. His army was a moving wall of iron, 8,000 strong, centered on a corps of heavily armored knights from Poland, Germany, and the elite military orders. Now, put yourself in the boots of a Polish knight. You're wearing 60 pounds of steel. You can barely turn your head. Your entire existence has been engineered for one perfect moment, the charge. The thunder of thousands of hooves, the couched lance, the unstoppable impact. This was the hammer of Christendom, and it was about to fall. But a hammer is useless if your enemy refuses to be an anvil. What the Europeans saw as a perfect battlefield, the Mongols saw as a perfectly prepared tomb. Their army was a living storm cloud of 10,000 riders, and it looked nothing like Henry's. They wore lighter armor of leather and silk, sacrificing protection for speed. Each warrior brought not one horse but 3 or 4, allowing them to swap mounts mid-battle and fight for hours without tiring. And their primary weapon made a mockery of European steel. The Mongol composite bow wasn't just a weapon, it was a statement. A statement that your expensive armor was irrelevant. Fired from over 350 meters away, its arrows could punch through mail as if it were cloth. The Mongols were not a wall, they were water, ready to flow around the European rock and erode it to nothing. From a low hill, the Mongol general Baidar watched the European host assemble, their banners snapping in the wind. For him, this was not a contest of honor. It was a clinical military objective. Neutralize this army to protect the main Mongol invasion of Hungary. He saw Henry not as a holy crusader, but as a piece on a chessboard, a piece he needed to remove with cold efficiency. Duke Henry, in his command tent, saw the same field and saw a stage for his glory. He was defending his faith and his people. A victory here would echo through Christendom for 1,000 years. For one man, it was a job. For the other, it was destiny. And only one of them had understood the true nature of their opponent. The day before the main battle, the psychological games began. Small squadrons of Mongol scouts would appear on the horizon, like ghosts made of dust and wind. They would ride just within bowshot, loose a volley of arrows that fell with unnerving accuracy on the European lines, and then simply vanish before any knight could lumber into a charge. They were taunting them, bleeding their morale, making the proud, heavily armored knights feel slow and clumsy. They were insects stinging a bear, goading it into a blind, furious rage. The knights grew restless, their honor demanding a decisive clash. Henry, pressured by his nobles and his own faith, agreed. The stage was set. The trap was baited. All the Mongols had to do was wait for the Europeans to spring it themselves. The battle begins not with a roar, but with a crack in the European discipline. Duke Mieszko of Opole, commanding the vanguard, can no longer stand the stinging harassment of the Mongol horse archers. Honor demands satisfaction. He gives an order, and the first wave of 2,000 knights thunders forward. To the Europeans, it is the glorious start of the battle. The ground shakes. Banners of griffins and eagles snap in the wind. They see the Mongol skirmishers before them falter, break, and then turn in a full-blown rout. A wave of triumphant arrogance surges through the charging knights. They smell blood. Their disciplined lines dissolve into a frantic race for glory, each man desperate to be the first to strike a blow against the fleeing heathens. But this wasn't a retreat. It was an invitation. The Mongol line doesn't just flee, it evaporates. It pulls the charging knights further and further from the safety of Henry's main army. The chase stretches out over a mile, then more. The heavy European war horses, bred for the explosive shock of a single charge, begin to tire, their powerful gallop slowing to a desperate canter. The knights are strung out, isolated, their cohesion utterly gone. To understand what happens next, we must leave the commander's view and drop into the saddle of a single Silesian knight. Your horse is heaving, its sides slick with sweat. The thrill of the chase has turned into a grim, lung-burning pursuit. You look to your left and right. The men who were once a solid wall of steel beside you are now scattered dots across the plain. You glance back. Duke Henry's army is a distant shimmer on the horizon. You are dangerously exposed. Up ahead, the Mongols you've been chasing suddenly split, wheeling their horses with impossible speed to the left and right, clearing the field before you. You see why a moment later. A fresh line of Mongol heavy cavalry is waiting, motionless. And you are charging directly into them. Before you can even process this, a new sound fills the air. It's not the clash of steel, but a dry whispering hiss, like a sudden storm wind tearing through grass. What followed was not a battle, but an industrial-scale slaughter. From concealed positions on both flanks, Mongol horse archers rise as if from the earth itself. They unleash a storm of arrows, a disciplined, continuous volley that darkens the sky. For a moment, all you can hear is the times thump, thump, thump times of arrows hitting shields and bodies. Knights who had been invincible in a head-on clash are now helpless targets, shot from the sides and back. Their exhausted horses, unarmored, go down screaming, pinning their riders under 60 pounds of useless steel. The charge grinds to a chaotic, bloody halt, and it is into this confusion that the Mongol heavy lancers, waiting patiently at the center of the trap, finally advance. They hit the disorganized, exhausted, and demoralized knights with the force of a tidal wave. The engagement is short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. The trap is sprung, and the jaws slam shut. A quarter of Henry's army is wiped from existence in less than an hour. The few survivors who manage to cut their way free and stagger back to the main European line are not heroes returning from a fight. They are ghosts, their faces pale with shock, their armor bristling with arrows, their stories a garbled mess of panic and disbelief. Then, a Mongol rider approaches the European line under a flag of truce. He brings no message of surrender. Instead, he carries a spike, and on it is the head of Duke Mieszko. He plants it in the earth just out of bowshot, a grisly testament to the fate of the vanguard. A wave of horror and rage ripples through Henry's army. His commanders counsel caution, his veterans urge him to hold the line, to force the Mongols to attack their defensive position. But Henry sees the head of his kinsman. He sees the shattered remnants of his best troops. The Mongol goading has worked perfectly. The bear has been stung into a blind fury. He will not wait. He will not defend. He will avenge. And with that single, fatal decision, the fate of thousands is sealed. What happened next defied all logic. Seeing the devastating trap that had just annihilated a quarter of his army, Duke Henry raises his sword. He gives the order to do the exact same thing, but this time with everyone. He is about to lead the flower of European chivalry into the jaws of the beast, but the Mongols had another surprise waiting for them in the tall grass. It was something that would turn the chaos of battle into a literal, living nightmare. The grand charge begins. It is the single most powerful expression of European military might, a force of nature made of iron and faith. 6,000 men, the core of Henry's army, lower their lances as one. The earth trembles. A deafening roar tears from thousands of throats as the solid wall of knights and infantry surges forward, a human avalanche designed to obliterate anything in its path. Before them, the Mongol screen of horse archers does exactly what they are expected to do. They break. They scatter in feigned panic, a sight that confirms every prejudice the knights hold about their cowardly foe. The charge accelerates, discipline melting away in a race for personal glory. The European line, once a cohesive hammer, stretches and thins over the plain, becoming a ragged spear point over a mile long, chasing ghosts. The infantry falls hopelessly behind, and the knights punch deep into empty space, pulled further and further from any hope of support. They believe they are winning. They are, in fact, marching into their own autopsy. This is where the battle transforms from a conventional fight into a psychological nightmare. Just as the lead knights feel victory within their grasp, the ground before them erupts, not with soldiers, but with a thick, acrid black smoke. Reeds and grasses, prepared with strange chemicals, are set alight, and a choking, unnatural fog billows across the field, swallowing the entire European vanguard. Visibility drops to the length of a man's arm. The sun vanishes. Suddenly, the thunder of the charge is replaced by a muffled, disorienting silence, broken by the panicked whinnying of horses and the confused shouts of men. Command and control ceases to exist. Banners, the eyes of the army, disappear into the gloom. A knight cannot see the man to his left or right. He is utterly, terrifyingly alone. And then, through the smoke, come the voices. Imagine the terror. You are a Polish man at arms, lost in the blackness. You hear a command shouted in your native tongue. Rally to me, this way. You turn towards the voice, seeking your comrades, seeking safety. But the voice is a lie. It belongs to a Mongol warrior, taught a few key phrases for this exact moment. You move toward the sound, and you are cut down by an enemy you never see. The black smoke is not just a weapon, it was a psychological bomb. It severs the bonds of unit cohesion and turns the army's own language against it. Out of the darkness comes the whisper of arrows, a constant, terrifying hiss from an invisible enemy. The knights swing their swords at phantoms, sometimes striking their own countrymen in the confusion. The most terrifying sounds on the field are not the screams of the dying, but the calm, coordinated horn blasts of the Mongol commanders, directing the slaughter from outside the smoke, their signals unheard and unseen by their victims. From his vantage point on a low hill, the Mongol general Baidar watches dispassionately. The smoke-filled plain below is not a chaotic melee. It is a machine of his own design, functioning with perfect precision. He raises a black flag. On cue, the trap closes. Mongol heavy cavalry, held in reserve on the flanks and hidden until this moment, wheel inward. They do not charge into the smoke. They slam into the exposed trailing edges of the European column, the infantry and lesser cavalry who have been left far behind by the knights' reckless advance. The rear of the European army is rolled up and annihilated before they even understand they are under attack. At the same time, the horse archers who had feigned the retreat have now circled around. The European army is no longer a spear. It is a writhing serpent, surrounded on all sides, blinded, and being systematically cut to pieces. With their primary tactic neutralized, the knights are no longer hunters. They are prey. A few pockets of discipline hold out. The elite Templars and Teutonic knights, more experienced than the rest, manage to rally. Surrounded, dismounted, they form a defensive circle, a bastion of steel in the chaos, their great helms like iron islands in a sea of black fog. They are the best of their generation, an unbreakable fortress of courage and plate armor. They brace for a final, glorious charge. But the Mongols do not grant them that honor. They simply stop, just outside of lance range, forming a loose circle around the Crusaders. They have no intention of charging. For every one Mongol who has fallen, 10 Europeans are being butchered. The odds are not in their favor. The odds are an equation that has already been solved. Then, on a silent command, the Mongol archers raise their bows. A calm, patient, methodical execution by arrow fire begins. The sound that breaks the European army is not the clash of steel, but the relentless times, thump, thump, thump times of arrows finding their mark, a sound that promises a slow, certain, and honorless death. Duke Henry, surrounded by his personal bodyguard, sees the battle is lost. His army has dissolved into a nightmare of isolated, desperate struggles. He sees his banners fall one by one. Panic sets in. He makes the final, human decision. He tries to flee. With a small contingent of his most loyal knights, he breaks away, searching for an escape route, any path away from the slaughter. But the Mongol army is not a blunt instrument. It is a net, and every escape route has already been closed. Fresh Mongol riders, held for this very purpose, run him down. His guards are overwhelmed. Henry, the pious, the shield of Christendom, is pulled from his horse, his armor a useless shell. In that moment, as he is surrounded by his captors, he sees his grand standard, the White Eagle of Silesia, topple and fall into the blood-soaked mud. The heart of the army is ripped out. With the Duke's banner down, the last pockets of resistance dissolve. What followed was not a battle, but a harvest. It was the moment everything changed, not just for Poland, but for the future of European warfare itself. The fighting ceases to be a contest and becomes a process. In the eerie, smoke-choked twilight, Mongol units move with a terrifying calm, not chasing a routed enemy, but culling a herd. For the dismounted European knight, the world shrinks to a prison of his own making. His 60 pounds of plate armor, once his greatest asset, now anchor him to the earth, a walking tomb. He can barely rise to his feet, let alone flee. Mongol foot soldiers, quick and unburdened, move through the chaos with maces and axes, their work brutally efficient. The dull, percussive crunch of steel crushing steel echoes across the plain, a sound far more intimate and horrible than the distant roar of a charge. This is no longer war. It is extermination. The greatest warriors of Christendom face a death devoid of honor. The surviving Templars and Teutonic Knights, their brotherhood a final shield, are not granted a glorious final charge. They are simply surrounded, a small island of defiance in a closing sea. They stand back to back, their swords ready, their prayers on their lips, waiting for the impact that never comes. Instead, the Mongols just wait, patiently, just outside the reach of their blades. Then, the archers begin their work. It is a slow, methodical, and soul-crushing execution by 1,000 cuts, a victory so total it erases an army from existence. As the last night falls, a new kind of work begins. The Mongol commanders demand account. Soldiers move across the blood-soaked field, their knives glinting in the fading light. This is not random savagery, it is bookkeeping. Each fallen enemy is recorded, not in a ledger, but with a piece of the man himself. The final, grim silence of the battlefield is broken only by the wind whistling through the reeds and the soft, methodical sounds of this terrible accounting. The age of the armored knight has ended in a single afternoon. When the smoke finally cleared, it revealed a scene from a nightmare. The ground was invisible, hidden beneath a carpet of the dead. For miles, there was nothing but stillness and the ruin of an army. The Mongol tally was completed. Their scribes recorded 9 large sacks, filled to the brim with the right ears of the slain. This was the receipt for their victory, a document written in flesh. The entire noble class of Silesia and much of Poland had been wiped out. Entire family lines, which had endured for centuries, were extinguished between the morning prayer and the evening dark. The legendary military orders, the professional core of Christendom's defense, were left as shattered remnants. News of the disaster did not arrive in a single, clear message. It crept across Europe as a rumor, a terrified whisper carried by the few blood-spattered survivors who staggered out of the slaughter. The tale they told was of an enemy that could not be fought, of a black smoke that choked the sun, of an army that vanished and reappeared at will. It was a story of witchcraft, of a force of nature, of the apocalypse made real. From the cities of the Holy Roman Empire to the papal court in Rome, a wave of cold terror spread. There was no other army. Duke Henry had gathered the last, best hope of the region. He had wagered everything, and he had lost. The road to the heart of Europe was now wide open, undefended. There was nothing standing between the Golden Horde and the fields of Germany, nothing to stop them from watering their horses in the Rhine. The Mongols had proven, with brutal finality, that no European army could match their discipline, their tactics, or their ruthlessness. They had shattered the very idea of European military supremacy. The conquest of the West was no longer a possibility. It seemed an inevitability. They stood at the gates of a defenseless continent, their victory absolute. The Battle of Legnica was over. The Mongols had won a victory so total, so absolute, that it should have heralded the conquest of Europe. But the battle's end was just the beginning of the story's greatest mystery. So why did they not advance? Why did the Golden Horde, with an open road to the Atlantic, simply turn around and ride away? The answer has nothing to do with any army in Europe. It has everything to do with a single death, half a world away. A messenger, riding day and night for months, had finally reached the commanders in Poland and Hungary. The news he carried was simple, and it was world-altering. Thousands of miles to the east, in the imperial capital of Karakorum, the great Khan Ogedei was dead. By the inviolable law of their empire, the Yasa, all princes of the bloodline were required to return to the heartland, every single one. A new great Khan had to be elected at a grand council, and the conquerors of Legnica were required to cast their vote. The invasion of Europe was not defeated by force of arms. It was simply postponed. Think about that. The entire course of European history was altered by a succession crisis. A continent was spared not by a sword or a shield, but by a funeral. But the Mongols left behind more than just a field of bones and a continent frozen in terror. They left a lesson, written in blood. Legnica was a brutal education. This was not a battle. It was an autopsy of an obsolete military doctrine. For 300 years, the answer to every tactical problem in Christendom had been the same: the glorious, unstoppable charge of the armored knight. That idea was slaughtered and buried in a single afternoon. The myth of European invincibility was shattered forever. And from that catastrophic failure, a new kind of warfare was forced into existence. Military leaders across the continent had to confront a terrifying truth. Chivalric honor was no match for disciplined combined arms tactics. Victory breeds complacency, but total defeat demands innovation. The result was a slow, painful, and necessary evolution. The rise of professional armies, the desperate search for an answer to the horse archer, a newfound respect for the power of massed missile troops like the English longbowmen. The seeds of the modern army were sown in the ashes of that Polish field. Europe had been shown a mirror, and the reflection was of an army that was slow, predictable, and suicidally arrogant. The survivors and the kingdoms they served would spend the next century trying to remake themselves in the image of their conquerors. And so, the impossible defeat of 8,000 knights became the bitter lesson that saved a continent. The age of chivalry died on that field, so that a new age of warfare could be born. An age that Europe, having learned from the masters of the steppe, would one day use to conquer the world.